think we're sort of full up in here, so best to get started. So you can see on the board my talk today is about improving assessment, the key to education reform. And you can see there as well my job title. I'm now the Director of Education at No More Marking. Before that, I used to be Head of Assessment at ARC Schools, so I spent a lot of time thinking about assessment from the point of view of primaries and secondaries, but now working for No More Marking, who provide online comparative judgment software. So improving assessment, the key to education reform. Might be maybe quite a bold claim. This is the blurb that I gave you that you probably saw in the booklet to decide to come here. So, and the reason I've said this, and the reason why I think this is true, that assessment is the key to education reform, is that if you want to change something, if you want to reform something, whether that be something as simple as just a little tweak in your own classroom, or as big maybe as policymakers making big national scale changes, how do you know if it's worked or not? And fundamentally, if you want to know if that change has worked or not, in some way, shape or form, you're going to need assessment. And if the assessment isn't right, you're going to think that things have succeeded when they haven't, that things haven't succeeded when they have, and all other kind of distortions that aren't very pretty. So that, fundamentally, in a nutshell, is what I want to say, which is that why do we need to improve assessment? It's because, not just in education, but in a whole range of fields, measurement of this type really matters. And if we think of assessment, if you like, as a subset of measurement, we can see that. So in any field you care to mention, better measurement leads to improvements in innovations, and bad measurement leads to distortion and unintended consequences. And I'm sure plenty of us can think of examples of that within education, but let me just give you a couple from outside education. So, as I say, at its most simplest, the reason why we need assessment is if you want to know if things are getting better or not, you need some way of measuring that. So, you know, take a really simple non-educational example. If you're running and you want to know if you're getting faster at running, you need some way of measuring yourself. You need a way of measuring time. So, the development of measurement of time, you can see that having a watch that's accurate, having a way of measuring yourself is really important there. But actually, as I say, that's the simplest way of thinking about why measurement's important. But you can think about these things in a more complex way too, which is that if you look at the history of the development of watches, of clocks, of timekeeping, you can see that it isn't just a sort of simple way of wanting to measure time that matters. I've put up here a really lovely book about the development of a way of keeping time on ships. So it's about John Harrison, who solved this problem of how you can measure accurate time when you're not on land. And what this book is showing, and what the development of timekeeping shows, is that measurement matters almost in these more complex ways. That having accurate measurement of time didn't just help you if you wanted to measure the time that something took, but it helped you to find where you were in the world. And modern GPS systems depend on accurate timekeeping in that sense. And similarly, I've got another nice one up here, Inventing Temperature. This is a book about the development of accurate means of measuring temperature. And again, something like time that we take for granted now, that we think of as part of our everyday life. But again, what this book shows is, first of all, how hard it was to develop accurate measures of temperature. And also it talks a bit about how some of the developments that it allows for. And it's talking about how measurement really is at the heart of so much scientific progress. And I really think that assessment sits within that same tradition for education. That if we can get better measures of assessment, we will be able to do so much more and know so much more about the practice of education. And that's the positive side of it. The negative side of it, obviously, is that bad measurement, as I said, can lead to distortion, it can lead to unintended consequences, it can lead to all kinds of outcomes that we wouldn't like to see. So what I want to do, that's a sort of little bit of theory. What I want to show now is that I want to show four assessment practices that I think are being influenced by, if you like, theory that isn't quite right. And these four practices, I'm going to say, I think they're quite prevalent, they're quite common. I think you'll have come across at least one of them in your schools. And actually, when you dig into the theory behind them, there's a theory behind it showing that these practices are not going to be that helpful. And for me, that's the thing I love about Research Ed, trying to bring together that bit of theory and practice. So here are the four assessment practices that I think are distorting. Number one, using Prose descriptors to grade work and give pupils feedback. Number 2, marking essays using absolute judgment. Number 3, viewing grades as discrete categories. And number 4, perhaps a slightly controversial title there, thinking that test scores matter. So it's a bit of a clickbait title there. We'll come to that one, I'll explain it a bit more. So what I'm going to do now is go through each 4 of these and tell you a bit about why it is that this quite common practice is not that helpful and what we could be doing instead. So first of all, using prose descriptors and rubrics to grade work and give pupils feedback. So what do I mean by prose descriptors? These kinds of things. So that's a little excerpt from the old Assessing Pupil Progress grids, which some of you may remember. A mark scheme. This is a mark scheme. This is from the new English GCSE. So anything really where you've got descriptions of what pupils should be able to do, descriptions in prose. Like we've got there. And I think in some ways this is such a common way of assessing that it's almost become assessing, that when we think of assessment, this is what we think of. And I can remember when I started at ARC schools 4 years ago, we were looking at life after levels then. It was the early days of life after levels, and we were thinking what could replace levels. And it was actually really hard to think of something that wasn't this. That everything you tried to invent that was new ended up being something that was a prose descriptor of some sort. And to try and think outside that was quite difficult. But it's important to think outside of this structure because there are a number of ways in which these kinds of prose descriptors are neither accurate nor helpful. So let's have a look at what I mean by that. Prose descriptors, I'm going to say that they're not accurate in terms of giving you a really accurate summative grade. So in terms of the main summative function you might use a prose descriptor for, which is to give a pupil a grade or a level or to somehow sum up their performance, descriptors like this can be very inaccurate. And I want to illustrate this with an example. So what we've got here is a prose descriptor. This is one that is quite tightly defined. I haven't picked a vague one here. I've picked one that's a maths descriptor, can compare 2 fractions to identify which is larger. It's pretty clear what that means, right? Because sometimes people say, oh, the problem with descriptors is if they're badly drafted. Well, this is pretty well drafted, it's pretty tight, it's pretty clear what this means. So let's have a look. We have 3 questions here, which are all questions which are legitimate interpretations of that descriptor. So all 3 of those questions are completely legitimate interpretations of that descriptor. So now I'm going to go over to you, have a think. We've got a group of 14-year-olds. What percentage of 14-year-olds do you think get the first question right? You can shout out some answers at me. What percentage of 14-year-olds get the first question right? 80, 90? 90%, excellent. So you're in the right ballpark there. What percentage get the second one right? 65, 70? Very nice, very close. 75%. What about that last one? 30, 40, 20, 50, 15. Okay. Right, and the reason I put that there, the reason I've shown you this is, as I say, this is a tightly drafted descriptor. It's clear what it means. Those 3 questions are clearly legitimate interpretations of that descriptor, and yet pupils find them very, very different in terms of their ability to answer them. And you will see this again and again and again, that tiny surface differences in a question have a big impact on the ability of the pupil to answer the question. So even something as simple as if you've got a sum, reversing the order of the numbers, that will have an impact on whether the pupils get it right or not. So you ask an 8-year-old, 11 plus 3, and then ask another 8-year-old, ask them 3 plus 11. Are those 2 questions of equal difficulty? And actually, you know, if you ask a child that often, if 11 plus 3, they'll go 11, 12, 13, 14. 3 plus 11, they'll go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and suddenly they're running out of fingers, and it's a harder question. So this is what I'm saying, even small changes in the structure of a question have an impact on that question's difficulty. And that's why prose descriptors inherently cannot give us the precision that we want. And what you really need for precision, fundamentally, you need the question. And we'll come to that in a moment. So that's one issue with prose descriptors. And bear in mind, as I said all along, that the descriptor I've given you here is quite a tightly defined one. It's from maths, which we think of as a more objective subject. If this is a problem with questions like this, how much more of a problem is it going to be with the kind of descriptors that I, as an English teacher, faced a lot of the time, which were something like, can use vocabulary with originality and flair, or can use vocabulary effectively. How hard is it going to be to grade or set questions according to those descriptors? And we'll come back to that a little bit more later as well. So that's one aspect, that prose descriptors are very, very hard to get the precision that we need from them. But you might say, okay, well, maybe they can't give us that precision, but aren't they still a useful structure for thinking about formative feedback? Can't we still use them to guide our pupils through the content we want to teach them, to give them formative feedback? And I'd argue no to that as well. I'd argue that they're not actually that helpful either. So I don't think they're accurate and don't think they're helpful. And what I'm going to show you here on this is something I've taken from Dylan William. This is from Embedded Formative Assessment. And he gives this very nice, quite amusing example of the problems with using prose descriptors to give formative feedback. And he says once he was talking to a middle school student who was looking at the feedback his teacher had given him. And the teacher had written the following: you need to be more systematic in planning your scientific inquiries. And you can imagine that's exactly the kind of written comment that you might take from a prose descriptor and you might use to give feedback to a pupil. So Dylan William asked the student what that meant to him, and he said, I don't know. If I knew how to be more systematic, I would have been more systematic the first time. And you think, yeah, good point. And Dylan William goes on to say that this kind of feedback, it is accurate because it describes what needs to happen, but it isn't helpful. The learner doesn't know how to use the feedback to improve. So it's like telling an unsuccessful comedian to tell funnier jokes. So it's true but not particularly helpful advice. And I must say, when I first read that, I did cringe slightly because I thought of all the bits of feedback I'd given which fell into that category. And I was talking to someone else about this, they were saying, oh, the number of times they write elaborate or add more detail, or even my thing, even something that sounds specific. I used to write, use more full stops. Okay, but what do you mean by that? Where should they go? Do you mean sort of scatter them like confetti? So when you stop and think about this, you suddenly realise, I think you realise the difficulty of giving really helpful feedback. Because it does have to be something very specific, and it does have to be something that a pupil understands and something that they can do. And actually, that's not always easy. And again, I think this is where perhaps our tendency to think of progress in prose is not helpful. And so what I'll do now is just a quick suggestion as to a way you can get around this problem. I think phrasing feedback in the form of multiple choice questions can be quite helpful. So instead of saying to pupils, you need to be more systematic, give them a multiple choice question. You don't have to create a different one for each pupil. You can have banks of them, you can reuse them, you can do it in a lesson, the next lesson. So I'm just going to do a little bit on multiple choice questions because I think they can be a really valuable tool for giving very specific feedback. But before I do that, I know that multiple choice questions get a bad rep. And they have a bad reputation, I think, in some ways for a good reason, which is that multiple choice questions are really easy to do badly. So what I want to actually show you is an example of multiple choice questions done badly, because by seeing that, hopefully, you see what to avoid. So this is what I think we need to avoid, and then I'll show you what I think we should be doing. So good and bad multiple choice questions. I have a question for you all. What is the capital of Moldova? And I'd like you all to know conferring on this one. You're going to put up your hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on what you think the right answer is. No conferring. Hands up now. Okay, what's great about this is the hands that go up first always get it right. And the ones that creep up afterwards are getting it wrong. So what I can see from that is this room as a collective whole does not know the capital of Moldova, because there was a pretty even split between the different numbers. So you don't know the capital of Moldova. Let's have a look at this question. Right, okay, wait, hang on. Now tell me. Hands up. What's the answer? Okay, right, so all of a sudden, a minute ago, not everybody did know the capital of Moldova. Suddenly, you all have got the right answer. Why have you got the right answer? It's because that question on the right is a very badly designed multiple choice question. because there's only one real plausible answer. The other answers can't really be right. And unfortunately, when you're tired and you're rushing, that's the kind of multiple choice question you end up writing. Because actually thinking of one that teases out the misconceptions is harder. So the insight here is, when you're creating a multiple choice question, you have to create unambiguously wrong but plausible distractors. And the problem, the good thing on the left-hand side is these distractors are unambiguously wrong, but they're still plausible. So you could plausibly think one of those was the right answer. The problem with these ones is they're unambiguously wrong, but they're not plausible. You know where those places are the capital of. You know it's not Moldova. So the great challenge in writing a multiple choice question is setting up the distractors. And the really good thing to do is to think of the common error your children make and put that in as a distractor. So don't start with the right answer. What I think people tend to do is put down the right answer and then think, oh, I need to think up some wrong answers to fill it in. Start with the wrong answer. Start with the wrong answers your pupils put all the time and then put the right answer. And that's, as I say, I think that is a really useful way of giving feedback. So here's an example. Suppose you've got a pupil in their maths papers having some difficulty with percentages. Instead of saying you need to work harder at percentages or you need to be more systematic about how you set up your percentages, you could give them this. What is 20% of 300? So, there's a right answer to this. I don't want to know the right answer. I'm going to see if anyone in the room can tell me what's the really common wrong answer that lots of pupils put and why. So there's a really common wrong answer here. Does anybody know it? Yeah.
15?
Yeah. And why?
Because you think of sort of dividing the 3 by 2, so you think it's sort of 1.5, half of 30 is 15, half of 3 is 1.5.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways of sort of getting there, but really, really common. So, correct answer, 60. Incorrect answer, the common misconception, I think this is a sort of similar way of saying what you were saying. Pupils often think if you work out 10% by dividing by 10, then you must work out 20% by dividing by 20. And actually there's a kind of logic to that, isn't there? And if a pupil's learnt that shorthand for 10%, they might just think, oh, I can just apply that through. So I just have to divide by 20. So that's a really good, I think you could use that as a feedback. You could use that as an activity in a lesson, but it's a really good piece that would give you some useful feedback about how your pupil's doing. And it's diagnostic, because depending on which answer they put, you're learning something about their thinking process. So I think that's a nicer way of giving feedback and a more helpful way of giving feedback than with the Prose descriptors. So that's my first, the first one of my bad assessment practices. That was Prose descriptors and written comments. So what was the bad practice? It was using Prose descriptors to judge work and give feedback. The good practice, I say, define descriptors as questions. Use those instead. And a bit more reading on that. Alison Wolfe is really good on why descriptors just can't be tight enough. They can't be precise enough. And also, in a more theoretical way, Michael Polanyi, who talks a lot about tacit knowledge and about how it's very difficult to capture quality in prose. So there's some genuine, as I say, quite deep theory underpinning this, which if you want to go away and read, that's a good starting place. So that's number one, the Prose descriptors and written comments. Number two, we're going to look at absolute judgment. The way that most of us mark essays at the moment is through a process of absolute judgment. That you're often looking at a piece of written work that people's done, and you're trying to grade it, often using the Prose descriptors against the Prose descriptors. And that's a really tricky way of thinking. And this is not just about essays, this is about lots of kinds of human cognition, that human beings are quite poor at absolute judgment. And again, I want to give you a little demonstration of why that is. Right, absolute judgment, here we go. So we have 3 activities, 3 actions up here on the left. Stealing a towel from a hotel, keeping a dime you found on the ground, poisoning a barking dog. So I won't ask you to talk about this one, I'll just ask you to think it through. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you place all of those activities? in terms of morality. So if 1 is not bad at all and 10 is evil, where would you place these activities? So have a think about that. Does anyone want to volunteer? No, the right answers. Don't want to put anyone on the spot, revealing their morality to the world. But anyway, hopefully you've got an idea in your head of where you would rank those from 1 to 10, those 3 activities. Okay, so I haven't just made these up. These come from this paper here at the bottom, Michael Moser. And what the researchers in this paper did, they gave one group those activities and asked them to rate those in terms of morality. They gave a second group a similar task but with different activities. So have a look at these. Testifying falsely for pay, using guns on striking workers, poisoning a barking dog. Now, can anyone maybe see the punchline here, see what's coming, maybe you're working it out? It's that the first group consistently say that poisoning a barking dog rates as being more evil. So, on average, I think the first group are giving number 3 7 or 8 on average. And lots of people, when I do this, they go for 10. The second group, I think, on average, are going 4 or 5. And why is that? I think you can see why it is, because we went through it. It's that when you're looking at those first set of actions, you're primed for thinking about poisoning the barking dog in terms of really trivial actions. So poisoning a barking dog seemed absolutely hideous in comparison to stealing a towel. Whereas when you see it in the second one, you're thinking more in the context of human beings being killed. So your judgment is changed. So this shows the sort of difficulty of trying to place things all the time on an absolute scale, like that of 1 to 10. And it's the same with essays. When you're marking essays, it's very hard to be constantly placing them on this scale in a sort of absolute, sort of dead reckoning sense. And I used to think the difficulty with grading essays was that getting different markers to agree. That you have one marker who thought this and another marker who thought that. But actually, when you think about it, it's not even that. It's you as a marker agreeing. Between the essays you mark in the morning and the ones you mark in the afternoon and the ones when you're tired. Just getting one person to agree when they're doing this process is extraordinarily difficult. But that's the way we go about it. We go about it in a method that is really not set up for how humans think. And so what's the alternative to absolute judgment? The alternative to absolute judgment is comparative judgment. So normally we ask ourselves, we mark absolutely, we ask ourselves, does this essay meet the criteria? I have one essay and I'm trying to place it on a scale. But instead, comparative judgment works by saying, is this essay better than this essay? So how comparative judgment works is you scan in all your scripts, you scan them in, they appear on screen to you, and you see pairs of them at a time, and you say which one is better. And you make a series of judgments like that, and your colleagues, or indeed even teachers you may never have met, make a series of judgments like that. And the algorithm that sits behind comparative judgment crunches all of those decisions and is then able to place all of the scripts on a measurement scale. And it's able to do that with a remarkably high degree of reliability. And the great thing about this is not only is comparative judgment much simpler and easier to do, so people when they do it for the first time are often just amazed at how easy it is to make those judgments. It also means, going back to the first point, you can reduce the reliance on the Prose descriptor. So you can, instead of having to tick things off on a Prose descriptor, you can make a holistic judgment about what you think the quality of these pieces of work are. So, absolute judgment, the bad practice, I said, is trying to mark essays absolutely. The good practice, use comparative judgment. What's the research? And the research on this, really interestingly, goes back quite a long way. So the first theory of comparative judgment was developed by Louis Thurston in the 1920s. Donald Laming on human judgment and absolute and relative is also very good. But as I say, the research goes back to the 1920s. But it's only really, I think, in the last a couple of decades and even really in the last few years that it's been able to be developed into this kind of online engine where you're able to use it quite quickly and quite efficiently. So obviously No More Marking, who I work for, that's what they do, comparative judgment. So that's the second issue I wanted to talk about, absolute judgment. The third is viewing grades as discrete categories. So this is one I think particularly an issue at primary, but I think we see it a lot at secondary too, which is this idea that a grade is a thing, and there is a qualitative difference between a pupil getting one grade and a pupil getting the next grade. And that's not true, and it leads to, as I say, some quite bad distortion. So let's have a look. Let's imagine we have 4 pupils. We have George, John, Paul and Ringo. And these are the scores they have received on a standardised test. So we can see that George and John are scoring just above 80 on the standardised test. Paul and Ringo are just under 120. So those are the scores that these 4 pupils are getting on a standardised test. If you look just at that, and that was the only information you had about those pupils, you would probably think to yourself, George and John have quite a lot in common. They're at they're getting a similar mark. And Paul and Ringo similarly have a bit in common. They're scoring at a similar mark. What would happen, however, if we layered grades on top of that? Let's have a look. And what I'm going to do now is layer the primary grading system over this. So here we go. What would happen if the only information you received about these pupils was their grade? So you'd now be thinking to yourself, George is working towards, John and Paul are at the expected standard, and Ringo's really flying his greater depth. So you can see how grades, particularly grades where you've got just quite small numbers and just 3 grades, can lead to big distortions like that. And if you think of a secondary teacher who's picking up these pupils in year 7 and is maybe making setting decisions or making some kind of intervention decisions based on them, you can see how that would be enormously misleading. So I think wherever possible, don't throw away information. Try and look at all of the information that sits underneath the grade. Even if you can't do that, or I understand people, grades are the currency we have, but always to be remembering still that a pupil who's just got one side of that line, there is no qualitative difference. I can remember when I was training to teach, doing some marking, some moderation, and an advisor coming into the school and saying, what you've got to understand is the difference between a C grade pupil and a D grade pupil is the C grade pupil they can analyse. That's what they can do. They can analyse, whereas the D grade, they're just stuck at description. And at the time, it felt really illuminating, like, oh, this is it. It's the secret magic key to getting a C. But it's not the case. That there might be a pupil who's doing some really good description that's actually very well written, who might be getting up and getting some marks and getting up to that C. And there might be a pupil who's using some of the phrases of analysis, but there isn't much analysis going on, and they're not getting that mark. And even so, even the pupils who are analysing, perhaps, they're just, the ones with a C and a D are on different sides of a line. So this idea that there's this qualitative difference is not the case, and I think it's misleading when we think in those terms. And I think, obviously, what doesn't help is the fact that primary, the grades are given these really emotive labels, like working towards, expected standard, greater depth. Now, to what extent is Ringo greater depth, because he's got a couple of marks more than Paul? And this is something Daniel Koretz, one of my favourite writers on assessment, he's attacked this approach, which is also quite common in America. And he said, grades are simply layered on top of the scale. That's all they are. And he says, the labels chosen for performance standards, and in the square brackets I've added ours, in America it's often proficient, and he takes aim at this use of the word proficient, have their own meaning independent of their use of the standards. And these clearly influence how people interpret the results they're given. So labelling this top grade greater depth, it is clearly, the greater depth, those words have a meaning in everyday life, and we are obviously going to use that meaning when we're looking at them. And that meaning is very misleading. So I think that's one of the issues with grades. If you are going to have grades, then I think it's better to have more of them and to number them. Obviously, there are issues then. The more you have, you can get into issues around measurement error, and the classification error then can become a problem. Probably the ideal situation is to report a scaled score with a confidence interval. But you can also see maybe that has issues around public understanding. But I think from our point of view as educators, if you're dealing with this kind of information, I think it's always good to remember that the grades are layered on top and to always be aware of what's sitting underneath, and also to be aware that what sits underneath, to be aware of that confidence interval too, that there's always measurement error. So that's the point about viewing grades as discrete categories. Okay, on to my final point now, which is thinking that test scores... Oh, wait, hang on, I'll just sum up this one. So yeah, viewing grades as discrete categories. The bad practice, viewing grades as discrete categories. Good practice, recognise their lines on a continuum. And Koretz is very good on this, and as I say, it's been a big problem in the US as well. So, on to my final point now, which is thinking that test scores matter. Thinking that test scores matter. So as I say, this obviously can sound quite controversial, like, hang on a minute, you've just spoken about assessment for this long, and now you're telling us test scores don't matter. I think what I'm trying to say here is that test scores on their own, just by themselves, don't matter. What matters is the inference that we're able to make from them. And there are a number of ways in which the inferences we want to make maybe can't be made from the test scores we're looking at. So let me explain that in a bit more detail. First of all, just a couple of quotations, one from Dylan William and one from Daniel Koretz, making this point about the importance of validity, of making valid inferences. So I'll just pick out the bits in bold. Dylan William is saying what we're interested in is what we can say from that evidence about what the student can do in other contexts. And Koretz making the point that this is the most fundamental principle of achievement testing. So it doesn't matter, if you like, the exact number of marks a pupil is getting at that moment in time, at that test they sit at 1:30 p.m, whenever in June. What matters is what is the inference you can make from that. So can you say off the back of this score in this maths exam that this pupil is capable of doing an A-level, that they're capable of taking, doing an A-level in maths, that they're capable of doing an A-level in something else, that they're capable of taking an entry-level job in a certain organisation? What is it you can say off the back of that? And of course the problem is that so many different stakeholders want to be able to make so many different inferences from exams. And I think the poor old GCSE has been crippled by the number of inferences that people want to make from it. But nevertheless, this is really important for us to bear in mind, and it's important for us to bear in mind that test scores are only samples from a wider domain. And when the link between that sample and the domain breaks, the performance on the sample is no longer telling us anything that is that useful. And I want to illustrate this with a few examples again from different fields. So here's just an illustration of what I mean. The sample is just a small selection from the wider domain. So if you think of the domain as being a pupil's, all of their knowledge and skills and ability in maths, and the sample would be what they're doing in that 2-hour, 3-hour GCSE paper. We can think of examples in other fields too. So one that's quite salient at the moment, political polling. So the domain with political polling, and Koretz uses political polling as an example, he talks about it quite extensively. The domain is the entire electorate, all the people who can vote. And when you read a political poll, you are reading the results from a sample of often just 1,000 people, a tiny sample. And as we know, there are plenty of things that can go wrong between that sample and inferences you can make about the wider population. But we also know that there are techniques and things you can do to try and get that sample to work and to give you something, an accurate prediction. The same is true of TV advertising, another one Koretz talks about. In order to work out how many people watch the TV and watch certain shows, actually, in America, they don't measure everybody who's watching the telly all the time. They do these weeks, 3 weeks of the year where they measure it then, and they use that as a sample to extrapolate. The Postal Service, in order to measure the times it takes to get a letter delivered to you. In the Postal Service, they measure this by sending out, if you like, test letters to just 1,000 addresses. And they say, well, if these letters are going to these 1,000 addresses in these times, we can predict what they're like with the wider domain. And similarly, to bring it back to academics, a vocabulary test. Vocabulary tests do not attempt to assess every single word a person knows. Because if they did, can you imagine how long that assessment would take? What they do is they take a selection, often just 40 words, And on the basis of that selection, and that selection is very carefully chosen, on the basis of that selection, they can tell you something about your wider vocabulary. But I hope you can also see here that there's enormous potential for distortion when you have a process like this. Koretz talks about how once the postal workers found out the sample, and so they made sure that those 1,000 addresses got really speedy delivery. And fundamentally, that's the same thing that goes on if you were cheating. If you knew those 40 words and you went away and studied up on those 40 words and came back and gave a word-perfect response to them all, again, it's the same thing. The sample's no longer telling you anything about the domain. So any exam, really, can never assess everything. It's only a sample. And because of that, we have to be really careful about that link between the sample and the domain, because when that breaks down, I think that's when we get some of the worst kind of distortions. And I would say I think we've really seen that over the last few years. I think we particularly saw it as well with some of the effects of accountability. And I think you saw maybe how quite a few of these different distortions all sort of came together. So I think this idea that grades were a discrete thing, combined with the 5A star to C measure, combined with the idea that it's just about the test score, led to people really thinking, I just need to, if we could just push these kids above the C grade, then that's it. We've done the job, that's the thing. But obviously then what you get is you get pupils who have got that C grade, but it maybe doesn't mean what you wanted it to mean. So it doesn't mean that therefore they are equipped to go on and study at sixth form in the way perhaps the C grade did mean X years before. So as I say, there are some of these practices which can damage the inferences you can make. And obviously you can't neglect the effect of high stakes assessment on this. And that's why I've put up here Goodhart's law or Campbell's law, which ties into all of these things, which is that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And you can see that with a postal delivery example, that whenever you apply high stakes to situations where you're sampling, there are risks. So that's the formulation of it. I think that's Goodhart's law. And Campbell's law is a more academic phrasing of the same thing, that whenever you put pressures on any kind of measure, you risk distortion. And I think that's something we absolutely have to watch out for. And as I say, I think particularly with that 5A star to C measure, you saw that issue. So thinking that test scores matter, let's sum up. Bad practice, thinking that the test score by itself matters. Good practice, recognise that what matters are the inferences that you can make from that score. What's the research? I think Dylan William and Daniel Koretz both very, very good on this. So if I just quickly then sum up, these are the 4 practical assessment errors I've talked about. I think there's a lot of theory there which can help us to move to a way of getting around some of these practical errors and develop some better ways of practice going forward. So I think I have got about 4 minutes. So I'll go out to you now for questions. Yeah.
Excellent talk. The common denominator across all 4 of these that struck me, the direction we're going, was that the failing here is human bias or intuition. And my gut feel here is that the solution to that is not to continue relying on human beings to do this task. And having been involved in some of this before, I think the technology has now matured to a level where it can do many of those things you mentioned as solutions better than humans, even on SE scoring. MIT's SE scoring systems are exemplary. They do the comparison things, the algorithms are there, stripping out the human bias. So I don't know what your judgment on that is. The question is, do you think it's heading in that direction with AI and machine learning, which can just do this superbly well to strip out the natural human bias that we all have in our brains?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right to say that the common theme here is, one of the common themes is about human bias. And not just bias, but distortion, just the way that judgment is hard. Human judgment is hard. And you're right, there's been a wealth of research on this in recent years, and it is fascinating about the way that our judgment is subject to these kind of distortions. I think the interesting thing, if you look in other fields, not just education, where people have come up with ways to get around some of these distortions, for me the interesting way is how human beings design systems to get around their own weaknesses. And some of those, lots of those, as you say, rely on technology. And I will talk about comparative judgment here, because I think what is fascinating about comparative judgment is the way that it uses technology, but it uses technology to enhance human judgment. So what's interesting about comparative judgment is that teacher judgment still sits at the heart of it. It is teacher judgment all the time saying which script is better. But it's a system that's designed to play to the strengths of human judgment, not the weaknesses. So I think in a world of humans, we can never get away from human judgment. I think the challenge is, how do you set up systems that correct for these common errors, that anticipate some of these errors, and that set up systems that allow humans to do the things that they're good at. And so, like I said, I am an evangelist for comparative judgment because I think it's a really good example of how you can use technology not to get rid of human judgment, but to improve it. So yeah, I think technology does have a big role to play. Yeah. One more. Yeah.
I'm also really interested in comparative judgment, and as a head of English, we trialled using it with our A-level scripts. We did trial it, but probably due to, I'm sure, our own ineptitude, but we got to a stage where we'd loaded all of the scripts and we'd done our comparative judgment and we had all of the essays scaled. But then we kept on running into, obviously, the block of the fact that we are, as teachers, bound to the exam rubrics, and then actually correlating that scaled score, if you like, with the essay grade, so the band, and then also on top of that giving the student feedback on the particular, on how to move beyond the band once you've done the comparative judgment. This was about a year and a half ago that we did that, so I don't know if there has been any development, but we found that it was just, the way it is at the moment was too difficult to actually implement in everyday teacher classroom practice. I wonder if you have come across any solutions for that, or what you would do in my situation. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think they're both legitimate points, and certainly I started using comparative judgment at ARC about 2 years ago, and one of the reasons I left ARC to work on this solely is because I think it's got enormous power, and one of the things I want to do is to address some of the issues that you're talking about. So I think the first one on how do you match it up with an exam rubric, I think the really interesting thing we've been doing, so we've done a lot of work at primary, and one of the things we did in our first primary pilot is to correlate the scores that came out of comparative judgment and the scores that came out on the primary interim writing frameworks, which are, I don't know how well you know them, but they're way, way more prescriptive even than the most prescriptive A-level rubric. And what we found was there was a very good correlation between them. In fact, my last year's talk at Research Ed, I presented that research. But what we also found is there were anomalies. And the anomalies were all as you'd expect, which were where somebody had written a really fluent and interesting and engaging piece of writing, but they'd spelt a couple of really difficult words wrong. they'd missed out. And pupils who had written very formulaic, tick-boxy pieces of writing that didn't make much sense, they'd done really well. They'd done really well on the interim frameworks. With comparative judgment, it was the other way around. So there were the anomalies, and you're right to point those out. All of our teachers felt the anomalies were the strength of comparative judgment, but obviously I understand if you're working with GCSEs and A-levels, you're in that system, you have to use it. What I would say is that GCSEs and A-levels, the rubrics are far less prescriptive than at primary. So we're running our first big GCSE pilots this summer, and we're going to investigate that. But as I say, even with those very prescriptive ones at primary, whilst it was an issue, you still had an overall good correlation. So you still did overall see that the pupils who were doing well on one did tend to do well on another. So that's one area, and you're right to pick it up as being important. The second thing around feedback, this is again something we're working on a lot, which is once you've done the judging, what feedback do you give to pupils? And what we're saying, and I'd say this actually even if it wasn't about comparative judgment, is again move away from written comments. And I think the written comments are just the most enormously sapping thing, and for me they're the opposite of a lever. A lever you should put a little bit of effort in and you get a lot out. Written comments, I feel like you put loads of effort in, you spend loads of time writing things, and you get a little dribble of impact. So what I would say is do whole class feedback. And if you do whole class feedback, it works very well with comparative judgment, because with comparative judgment you've had quick exposure not just to the work of your class but to the work of lots of other pupils too. So you can then give whole class feedback from a position of strength, of knowing not just your pupils' strengths and weaknesses, but how they stack up to others. So I would go with a lesson of feedback. I would go with not with comments written at the bottom, and I'd say that regardless of comparative judgment. I'd go with whole class feedback based on your reading and your understanding of a whole set of scripts. And I think that can work really well collaboratively. Once you've done the judging together, you can plan that whole class feedback lesson afterwards. So I think those are two key issues around how you use it, and I hope that's given you a bit of an idea for the way forward. Great. Thanks.